Welcome to Another Education is Possible, a podcast about education's radical potential. I'm your host, Jordan Corson. In May of 2024, Thea Abu El-Haj wrote in Truth Out about the criminalization of student organizers at Columbia. And she asks, and I'm going to quote here, what if instead we recognize student protesters as educators, fully engaged teachers and learners in our community? A few months before that, in my little subfield of anthropology and education, I got to listen to Thea accept the Lifetime Achievement Award. There, she reflected on her time as an undergraduate. And during the Zionist invasion of Lebanon and bombardment of the PLO in 1982, Thea described how she was one of 3 people protesting on her campus. When the encampments emerged, I was really thinking about Thea's speech and the stark contrast between her experiences and the thousands of students acting as educators and learners in their communities. At the same time, today's guests, J and A, which are pseudonyms, 2 student organizers who talk about their experiences building an encampment, as they remind us, the encampments shouldn't be romanticized. And also, I hope this episode kindles the political imagination and reminds us of the possibilities born of radical solidarity. It's amazing to have you both here. I think, as I mentioned when we've spoken before, that the encampments has been this ghost floating around the podcast almost in every episode, talking about the educational possibilities that it offers and the ways that it challenges formal education structures. Just for our listeners, a bit of practical stuff. We're not going to use names because of the intense repression that folks who have been involved in encampments have faced. And we're also not going to name your university beyond saying it is a small liberal arts college that faced severe repression from administrators. Within that, we're going to talk about your experiences within it and so much else. Before we jump in, maybe without sharing too much information about yourselves, the 2 of you could give us a brief introduction of who you are and what your role as activists within the university are. And maybe we could start with you, Jay.
Yeah, I am a student of history and environmental studies. I was involved throughout my freshman year in different organizing capacities, environmental justice groups on campus and other organizing groups. And I kind of took on a role in Palestine organizing in the fall of 2023 after the Al-Aqsa flood, and specifically in kind of the JVP, Jewish student organizing space, which wasn't really very developed at all. There wasn't really a super active JVP at all, but that was kind of how I entered in. I'm no longer affiliated with that org, but that was kind of my entry in. And also just I had been involved in Jewish campus life, and I think I kind of realized in the fall that of 2023 that I couldn't really be involved in Jewish life on campus without making anti-Zionism a core part of that, and political anti-Zionism a core part of that. And yeah, so that was kind of a big part of my political organizing, and then also just being a part of the sit-in that happened in the fall of 2023, and then also the encampment.
Awesome. Thanks. What about you? Hey, just share a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I am a incoming junior. I'm also a history student, also separately a computer science student, which is less fun. I joined SJP my freshman year of college, in October, essentially, right after Alex and Flood. I have basically been with them for last year and a half, almost 2 years now. And at first it started, I was very new to organizing in general at the time. So I was kind of just like looking up everyone with like awe and kind of just trying to like learn the ropes and everything like that. And then I joined leadership in like January of 2024. And I've been in leadership the whole time too. And now I'm kind of like one of our veterans, which is a bit interesting.
I want to jump all the way back to the beginning and think about how the two of you ended up at the encampments. So, what did Judaism, Zionism, and Palestine look like for you growing up?
I can start with this one. I would say I think it was definitely much less of a part of like my upbringing. My family's not Jewish, but I think that for me, what really clicked like when I was younger, like the first time I really learned about it, my oldest sister went on a trip to Palestine in like 2017, 2018, here we go. I wasn't super young, but I was like 12, 13. And that was like obviously really eye-opening for her, but also pretty eye-opening for me. Just like I obviously couldn't understand the gravity of things at that age, but just like hearing her testimonies and like when she was there, they fully like saw the like border fence and everything like that, prison fence. And they even like met with like settlers and got to speak with them, which was also just like a harrowing experience of just kind of the ways that a lot of them spoke about Palestinians in general. So I think that was like the first time I really like thought about it. I remember one of my first memories of any like controversy was like one time she made an Instagram post where the Instagram location was Tel Aviv and then Israel, and then in the caption she put like hypo Palestine, and then she got like mass reported, which I think was funny. My sister's a pretty big inspiration for me, so I think it was always pretty like, even if I didn't know too much when I was super young, it was kind of just like there's an apartheid.
So this was very much a family education. You weren't necessarily having things assigned in school or teachers affirming things as learning from a sibling.
No, it really was not something that was discussed in school at all. I feel like something I really think about is like, the way that like 20th century history is taught in the US, because that is like a whole course I took, and that's like supposed to be your senior year history course, semi-school. For me, like 20th century is like century of like decolonization, transition to monopoly capital, like all the struggle and like, the reading of the Cold War, that's like the bipolar world and just the destruction of the global south. And we read it as like America. Oh, like FDR was pretty great. That's like kind of what we learned about. My history teacher was a bit more based, and that like he would definitely be like, you know, after partition plan, things were divided up. But it was not like no history. I feel like actual history I had to learn entirely on my own. That's just not something you learn in class. At least in high school for me. I think, but also I went to a kind of like a liberal type of high school.
So really still very much present, but happening, you're mentioning, through family and being exposed through social media to these ideas that directly run counter to what's happening in formal education. So Jay, what did Judaism, Zionism, Palestine look like for you growing up?
Yeah, I grew up in a Jewish but pretty secular household. I grew up in New York City in a very Jewish neighborhood. So that was kind of like Judaism was like a cultural identity for me, more so than a religious one. And the people in my family, I don't have anyone in my family who's like a ardent Zionist. And the people in my family have mostly been either like didn't really talk about Palestine, but also didn't talk about Zionism at all with me growing up. Or I have had and I still do have family members who've been really important in kind of my political consciousness and have been like very vocally anti-Zionist since I was younger. I think growing up in that setting, I was surrounded by plenty of people who like were going on birthright trips, and I always felt kind of uncomfortable with that, but I didn't really have the historical context and wasn't like learning much in school to really deal with why I kind of thought everyone's birthright trips and like Zionist tendencies were like just off. But I didn't really like have that kind of vocabulary. And then in conversations with my sister and also my aunt and cousins who were all involved in organizing for Palestine and different SJPs at their colleges and just in their lives, I kind of learned a little bit more in like high school. I remember my sister gave me like Freedom is a Constant Struggle, the Angela Davis book, and that was kind of like my introduction because I didn't really know like the details of that history and I didn't understand the connections between the Zionist entity and the United States at all before reading that. So that was kind of me starting to see myself as like an anti-Zionist and just to get like acquainted with that history. And I also, I think a big part of why I have more like anti-Zionist family members, my grandfather, who was a refugee from Germany in 1939, he was very like vocally anti-Zionist and kind of raised my dad and my aunts with that kind of sentiment. So I do think it's kind of a benefit for my development as a person that I wasn't like surrounded by Zionists, um, like many other people who live in New York and are Jewish are.
That's amazing to have a lineage of anti-Zionism, but it sounds like it took shape a bit more as you were getting older, that you weren't necessarily raised with an explicit anti-Zionism. It was more a non-Zionism or something kind of in that mix until you started to encounter more political texts. So you both have forming political ideas as you come to university. How did that take shape? How did that exist in kind of more formal settings like classrooms? Were you encountering professors, less formal places? You mentioned that JVP wasn't really prominent, but before the Al-Aqsa flood, were you still forming your political identity, hopefully, in history classes? I'd love to hear in CS classes, but yeah, what did it look like as these ideas start to take shape?
I don't know. I think that my education, like real education, has largely been outside of the classroom. I think that I have taken some, like more recently, I've taken some like really interesting, like really good history classes with like better professors, kind of like post initial radicalization, which like helped me like contextualize, like get a real understand like imperialism, anti-imperialism, like the development of these projects and things like that. That stuff has been really important. But in terms of like the sewing scene, I think that like I was always very interested, and one of the things that was like a bit better was like in AP US history, which is also just war propaganda. The one thing that I was interested in was like Reconstruction and understanding like what exactly that meant. And I don't know, I just think that like before I understood the settler colonial analysis of it, it was just very, the US was built on slavery. These are the systems that were built upon, right? I never really believed in this neoliberal, like America's fundamentally good. I don't know. I would say honestly, I don't know if you know like Blowback podcast, like Noah Cohen podcast. That like really, when I was in high school, like really helped me think and like started to get me thinking and stuff like that. I came to college and I was taking this Israel Palestine class and it was taught incredibly liberally and very two sides. And then the contradictions just really blew up in my face, I think. And that's when I started to like really read and like really like understand like what's going on. And then like a lot of really cool history professors who also knew a lot about like Palestinian history and gave me a lot of recommendations and things like that post October 7th. But yeah, I think, when people talk about how October 7th really like woke up the world, it's very true. Very, very true. Just in terms of like really, really actually like focusing in on what does it mean to like organize in an open air prison? So yeah, I think that's just like what really helped my educational development. It was like those initial strains from high school younger education of like history of slavery, legacies of Reconstruction America, the ways it failed, uh, and then just really thinking about like the empire and like trying to get an understanding of like living in the empire. Yeah. Shay, what about you?
Yeah, I think like in high school, I definitely didn't have a lot of teachers who kind of shaped my like political consciousness. I think I was definitely shaped a lot. Like I think pretty much everyone our age was like shaped a lot by COVID and also by like the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020. But I think that like moment of just like lockdown kind of changed a lot for me and was like a moment of a lot of like radicalization like beyond the classroom and kind of finding a lot of ways of just like political education, I guess at that point all like online. But yeah, a lot of different podcasts and books and stuff that I was like turning to kind of try and understand like everything that was going on because it was just such a clear moment of at the time it kind of felt like, oh my gosh, everything is falling apart and completely different. And that was kind of like a moment of like reckoning and just realizing like how much information is out there that I wasn't being taught in the classroom. And then I think once I kind of had that background and also just the understanding that like my own like political education, like being in community with other people and trying to like find resources that are not just like the mainstream liberal education that I was being taught. I think once I had that, it was easier to kind of go into college and continue to like be committed to searching that out for myself and also being able to like figure out when I think for the most part I've had a lot of like good history courses with professors who like really helped me to kind of understand imperialism and capitalism a lot better and kind of have like a critical lens for that. But I think just like in high school, like that moment of searching out education for myself helped me to um, understand better like the kind of primary like contradiction of imperialism and to use that as a lens to like understand the history that I was learning and to kind of see when like the syllabus is leaning towards just like liberalism.
This is probably a question for later, but it's already bringing up these deep tensions for me. And I'm wondering if you all see a place for formal education, because I'm hearing you're developing critical thinking in school to an extent, some seeds, some small little moments that maybe push you towards understandings, but it's still within a colonial framework. You're developing some alternative ideas or being exposed to certain elements of history, but you're not being taught to think from below or act from below. You're still reading this narrative of the US is ultimately a good thing. The empire should be protected. And that makes me wonder, do you see universities as having a role? Of course, they're in practice, they're colonial institutions that are there to be landlords. But I am wondering do you see universities as playing a role in liberatory education? Or are your paths kind of the ones that need to be taken, always kind of set against the university?
I think our political context in the United States is like important. What I think about this, like I think that there are a lot of universities that internationally have played really important roles historically. I also think of like the General Union of Pasadena students and like a lot of like important like radical redefining and construction that has been led by like student movements. In that case, having an institution is useful in the purpose of like organizing against. But in terms of the actual like educational aspect, I don't know. I don't personally think so. I personally don't really believe in the university as a structure. Of course, for the things that you named as like, you know, the university is a colonial apparatus. It is a construction of the most explicit operation of like intellectual property, like who deserves to learn, who doesn't. But I think even on a level of, for example, like free university, I think of, in India where I am right now, education is much cheaper. There's a lot of universities you can access much easier. But that in and of itself does not equate with like genuine politics that are like liberatory, because I think a couple things. I think one is the upholding of the nation and the nation state where the university is predicated is almost always necessary in this context, and like in the context of like, when the university is where you rely on your liberatory education, you fundamentally have to see it as good, whether or not you can take it or whether or not you can be like, hate this university. I hope this university is destroyed. If you rely on the university for your education, then actually you can't have it destroyed, because you rely on it fundamentally. I mean, and that contradiction is definitely present in all of us, like as students who are like, oh, death to the university. We're also attending these universities. But yeah, I think on the level of education, like, at least for me, I have learned the most from other people and also other organizers. And I think that's why, not to get like too ahead of ourselves, but I think that's why something like an encampment or like or even like any successful experience with a political organization is a real form of education. Because I don't know, I mean, something like I think of George Jackson a lot in terms of like uh cause and effect. And instead of being like, why aren't people thinking about other forms of education? Why aren't people seeing the university as an evil form of education? It's like, really, we have to start experiencing other forms of education and like really understanding that like we can build an alternative. And that only really comes from like learning from the people around you. I also think the main thing is that universities discourage you from learning about the material conditions around you. Universities exist in so many different places, and they're like teaching all these incredible things inside the university. And there are always communities outside every university you can think of that has been dispossessed.
I did have the question that you then jumped on to start this, which is it's also contextualized, because I was going to ask, but what about in Palestine? I always come back to, yes, we should. I mean, I say this as a professor, but like we should burn universities to the ground. And also, like I think a lot about Pierce State University, where in the West Bank, where the PFLP has done a lot of work. I don't think it's the same issue to talk about scholasticide. Right? I think you can fight for the right of people who have jobs to not be targeted, and individual scholars and teachers who are being systematically killed. But I do think it's worth noting the struggle for schools and for universities that Palestinians engage in regularly. So I think, as you point out, it's important to situate the burn the university to the ground as something rooted in settler colonialism.
I think it's similar also to like the acceptance of third world nation states under the anti-imperialist framework of like, all states in some ways are inherently like a dictatorship of the oppressed class, but in the position, like certain states and sovereignty have such immense importance. And the same thing with like, universities in Gaza being destroyed actually is insanely irrelevant. And Palestinian professors and that like process of education, eradication is like, that in many ways of itself is sovereignty also.
I believe very strongly in like the importance of building new institutions of like radical education that are about horizontal pedagogy and are about building political consciousness and having a critical lens to view the world through. And I also agree that educational institutions, specifically the university, are never going to do that. I agree that like even free like public institutions under capitalism and colonialism are still going to reproduce those same issues that like the private liberal arts college does. But also I do believe in the importance of like building new like the people's university that has been used to like frame the student movement. I think is really important. And I think it's most like effective when we understand how direct action and reflection about that direct action is like how to build political consciousness. So any like educational institution that would be liberatory would kind of be in itself like encouraging students and participants to like be people who engage in direct action and people who are radicalized and are educating themselves in order to like build a better future. And also, I guess I'll just like briefly mention, I think one book that kind of impacted how I think about it was like the Undercommons. Like, yeah, classic. I think self-consciousness about university consciousness is like so prevalent. Like, I feel like there's so many instances in like our classes where we're just discussing like the liberal arts college and whether or not the class that we're currently taking is like doing anything to fight for liberation. And I think there's so many examples of learning about capitalism and imperialism within these institutions that ultimately just allow a sense of like moral superiority and like justify continued engagement in the institution and ultimately continue to uphold those same systems. So all that to say, yes, I agree. Burn down the university and also build up like new people's universities and new like institutions that are places of like community learning.
Glad you brought in the undercommons, since I have to constantly remind myself to be host. That's Stefano Harney and Fred Moten's book, which I was thinking about when the two of you have kind of been hinting at this idea of like, yeah, we're opposing settler colonialism and we're also attending this liberal arts college. And I think about Fred Moten has said like, I'm a professor and it's a fucking job. Like, I go to work, it's a job, right? We all live in capitalism, but that also relates to then kind of what the two of you have contributed to, which is what Harney and Moten say is the only possible relationship to universities, which is a criminal one. So let's talk about, I'm not saying the two of you have been criminalized. We're not saying there have been any charges or anything to anyone, but let's talk about this thing that has been criminalized. These beautiful experiments, this wonderful challenge to universities, this act of solidarity, the encampments.
I'll give it to Jay to talk a bit more about like this sit-in in like the fall of 2023, because I was a bit less involved in like organizing back then. But one of the things like for me, that was like the real point of radicalization for me, because I, you know, was like pro-Palestine in the normal sense, but I didn't really have like a developed politics. Basically what happened was, in the fall of 2023, when there was basically like a sit-in in the admissions office of the university, the most important outcome, I think, of that was not even necessarily like the material pressure, because like in many ways our school has had a lot of sit-ins. It wasn't necessarily something that was like, oh, divestment now. But what was really important was what it kind of fostered was this environment like where we would have like 80 to 100 person nightly like discussions about Palestine. And that went a really long way, I think, in especially like sowing the seeds for the spring, because it also just like engaged so many people around like, what does divestment mean? What are we actually engaged in? What is our university engaged in? Like really connecting Palestine to the individual lives of every student, because it's not disentangled, obviously, but like those connections do have to be drawn. And I think that like holding that space, even as an educational space for the encampments, was really, really cool, because also like there were teach-ins every single night. I remember I watched a really cool teach-in about architecture in Palestine and Israeli architecture as Zionist architecture as a method of ethnic cleansing and expansion. A lot of this stuff is still pretty jarring, and it can jar a lot of people's political consciousness. So I think, yeah, like not to just like harp on that one specific example, but I think like the seeds are really sown by like having spaces to hold conversation. And I think that's why these things are so important, because classrooms are not that space, especially in a context like of our school, where like I literally know people who have gotten disciplinary charges for things they've said in class.
Just as a point of clarification, because I'm thinking about what Jay pointed out when they said that this opens up different pedagogical relationships that are horizontal. So were these 80, 100 person events, were they mostly student organized, student led? Were there faculty involved and things like that?
I think there were like a couple times, or like some faculty people that maybe. But yeah, they're entirely student organized. So it would basically be like the nightly organizing meetings. And obviously there was like a core leadership team that did a lot of logistical work and like leadership planning and like final decision making and everything like that. Just much more clarity was where I think that yeah, like it just breathes a different pedagogical approach.
And
Yeah.
you brought in space. Jay, I don't want to frame your response too much, but I would be interested if Judaism factored in at all here.
A lot of what made them so effective was like even when there were kind of faculty or like adults like in the room, there was kind of an emphasis on allowing student organizers to hear each other and have the space to figure out how to run meetings in an efficient way and actually be able to like hear each other, whether that's based on, someone sharing like a meeting they had or like a project campaign that they've been working on, or if that's just like the opportunity for people to kind of learn about each other. I think there were moments where I realized like, oh, this person has like this firsthand like lived experience that is relevant to what we're learning about that I never would have like known about them if there hadn't been this like space for those conversations. And also I think like institutional memory and sharing knowledge of the types of student protests that had happened on campus in the past was a huge part of what made these kind of teach-ins and community discussions so important, because we were able to get a better understanding of past student movements on our campus, and also through that predicting a little bit more how we thought the institution would respond to us just based on this memory. And I think part of the institutional memory that I was learning about was also involving a little bit about like the Jewish groups on campus, because I came onto campus wanting to like learn more about Jewish spirituality and kind of get more involved because I came from a secular household, but I was excited about there being a space on campus that wasn't a Hillel or a Chabad, but was like another Jewish space that was very open to queer Jews and like different relationships to Judaism. And I found that to be like a more kind of welcoming space for me. And also through kind of these discussions about institutional memory, learned more about like the open Hillel movement and movements in the past of like Jewish students breaking away from Zionist institutions, and just understanding why the Jewish organizations that existed on campus, like how they came to be and why they existed, and like what these organizations are, how they relate to our campus as a whole. So that aspect of like just getting a better understanding of the types of activism that has happened on our campus in the past was really helpful, I think, for all of us.
So clearly it was pretty active, but this led to an encampment. So can you talk about how logistically, politically, how this all came together? And what's it early April, mid-April of 2024 look like on the ground at your university?
So actually, interestingly, one of our core members a month or so before the encampment started as like a phenomenon, kind of like submitted to us this plan of like a popular university and this idea of having a popular university on campus and like holding a space for the purpose of like radical education and like maintaining the popular university formulated off the model that came from Palestine. It was really interesting, but it was kind of a situation where they like wrote up this plan and sent it, and people either like some people didn't read through it, or some people were just like, oh, like that doesn't really seem kind of feasible. Like that's cool and all, but like we need to be doing more like infrastructure work. We need to do more base building. At the time, we had kind of lost a lot of that momentum from the sit-in because like winter break. And then we came back in January and everyone was like, oh, like what's SJP gonna do? Like we didn't do it. And like we were kind of trying, we didn't have any like actions necessarily because we were like trying to figure out infrastructure things. We are trying to figure out like, okay, like what's our real, there's been an influx of people now. SJP is now 3, 4, 5 times bigger than it was before this. But yeah, so interestingly, it was this development of we were like power mapping all the faculty at the school. And we were power mapping student organizations. And we were power mapping like different clubs, things like that. And like trying to get like sports teams to be maybe considering like boycott or like, and like getting clubs to sign on to like BDS resolutions and things like that. Like our horizons were much smaller, to be honest. And then we're all on our phones when Columbia starts and everyone is tweaking. I feel like everyone talks about this and it's like it's obviously good not to like romanticize, but like that first day, those first 24 hours when the first encampment started were genuinely pretty crazy. Because like it wasn't really, yeah, I don't know. It removed discourse in a lot of ways because it was a lot of like, what are we going to do with this semester? Like, how are we going to do this? Columbia started and we were like, okay, we need to start planning basically immediately. And what was also lit, basically like once Columbia started, a particular national organization hosted a group call from organizers on the ground at the Columbia encampment with every school in the country. And it was basically Columbia being like, this is how you build a popular university. And then that was on Friday. And we planned our entire encampment on Saturday and Sunday. And we started on Monday. So it was just like really jam-packed, even though like some schools have been a lot more consistent than others. But just like the fact that it was like every school was kind of itching for something, and a lot of schools didn't really believe in themselves, ourselves included. Like our horizons were pretty low. And then it's like, okay, you see the school in the heart of New York with it's literally an Israeli military base at this point with SRG units and the NYPD just going ridiculous. And they start an encampment. And you're like, okay, we'll be fine. Because I think that like the infrastructure work and the ideas and conversations we had before were really, really important because also like we did rely on those connections with other organizations pretty hard. Like we planned the encampment, yes, with SJP, but also with a lot of other just like be radical students in different affinity groups who like really wanted to help. Also, we're really good at setting up tents. But so like those connections are important. But yeah, I really just think that like it changed everyone's horizons. But yeah, I don't know. Jay, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think like that kind of weekend of planning things was so hopeful. I think it's kind of seeing what had happened at Columbia and what was starting to happen at other schools. I'm just like knowing that we were going to be in like a much larger wave of student encampments was really inspiring and kind of was able to give us a sense of hope, especially as we started to, you know, maintain the encampment. I think we weren't like sure how long it was going to last and uh like what was going to end up happening. And I think also part of it was like there had been some like disciplinary cases, but like the kind of mass scale of university repression hadn't really happened at all yet. And so I think there was just a sense of looking back, maybe a little bit like naive, but also just a sense of like hope and a lot of faith in like what this kind of movement of encampments could like accomplish. And also just a sense of the process of establishing our demands and establishing our goals in itself was helpful for getting people to like understand what we were talking about earlier, like what our direct role in the genocide is, like as students, like what ways like our tuition dollars are going to fund the genocide. And it kind of just disrupted our lives in a way that was really powerful. I think just like being present at the encampment was like there was always something going on, whether that was like a film screening or a teach-in, but the focus was always on Palestine and also on community outside of the structures of the university. Even though we still were on our campus, we were kind of thinking strategically of how do we steal university resources and use them to our advantage and use them to build this community that we've created. Like, how do we bring in people outside just our campus and build a true sense of community with comrades who are either at other schools or also just like from the surrounding communities. And I think just like having that mindset of how are we constantly building community and building those connections and constantly thinking about Palestine and making that like the center of our lives. That was like really powerful.
I would definitely agree. I think just on that note of like, events and political education, I don't know. I think it was just making the encampments in many ways. Like people talk about this a lot. I went to a conference and spoke to some like former Panthers, and they were kind of talking about like how this whole thing of like, why aren't people joining? Why aren't people, trying something new? It's like they have to see and know that something new is possible. And I think like it's not only that it has to make something new, but also it has to seem sick. Like, it has to seem pretty cool. Not in the like modern construction of what coolness is, obviously, but on the level of it has to be like, damn, actually the people doing the radical shit, the people who are like actually pushing things forward also seem like they're doing something really fascinating that like I want to be a part of. And with the encampments, like, I also think this had a lot of drawbacks as well. Sometimes it was a bit unserious and sometimes it was a bit glamorous, if that makes sense. And I definitely think there was a large issue also, especially as like the reality of the fall kind of started setting in and like, they charged 25 students and like shit started getting real and everyone started disappearing. I will also say there was the drawback of like people who were also there for this, specter of it. But I I think even if there were people who were there like that, I think that's why the political education was so important. Because even if it was like, oh yeah, I'm just there because everyone's at the encampment, like Jay said, you then still had to engage Palestine. And I think that was like really important in our modern like neoliberal framings of like democratic education. We have this idea that it's like, oh, you'll learn about Palestine if you're compelled to do so and you find you're interested in it and you decide to Google it. And it's like, that's actually incorrect. And actually, you should be learning about Palestine, especially when there's a genocide going on and you're funding it. Actually, I don't care if you're, I'm more interested in learning about like plants right now. Learn about the plants, don't get me wrong. But then also maybe learn about like what plants are being destroyed. So to actually go back to that like academic space, I don't know. I think it was really cool also just because it was informal. And I think that like, especially at private liberal arts colleges where people are like, oh, we're less competitive. We're more about like social justice in the classroom. But there is a level of formality where it's also like, okay, if you can't articulate ideas properly, you shouldn't have them. And I think the thing that was so useful with the encampment is like everyone is having new ideas and nobody has these fleshed out because we've never done this. So I think that was really cool. It was the first time, I mean, admittedly late, but like the first time I listened to like a full like Mumia audio recording, like a Mumia podcast testimony from prison was at that 2024 encampment. Like we should be talking about political prisoners, just like broadening our horizons from moving from like being ostensibly pro-Palestine to like actually grounding ourselves in like the legacy of the struggle. Yeah, and then the last thing I wanted to mention was like, Jay mentioned about like we kind of focused on learning about different types of community. I mean, everyone knows this, but you just meet so many people and meet so many people that you like wouldn't have met otherwise. I do think one of the things we reflected on about like 2024's encampment, which is why like when there was another encampment in 2025, we tried to focus a bit less on this. It was like in 2024, I think also like for security and for acceptance, a lot of what we were doing was like, let's get professors to teach their classes at the encampment. And that wasn't bad by any means. Like, it was also really cool to see professors there. And a lot of professors did show up. And that was really dope. But I also think it confined us a bit too much to, again, that same type of structured learning, like hierarchical. The teacher inherently has more authority and different things like that. And I think the one thing we have been focusing on a lot more recently is like actually trying to break down the ivory tower in that now we want our speakers to be organizers, community organizers, people who are moving from beyond, collection to praxis. And because actually like learning from people who have been organizing for a long time and who have been doing this shit before we were born, like is so important. And I think the way that university is constructed to also keep us from those forms of knowledge and demonize those forms of knowledge in terms of like real lived experience of like the struggle, that's just not something that you can learn from a book, and that type of praxis and like meeting those type of people is really good. And yeah, our school is very big on having lectures and having more like lefty academics come and speak. And there's discussion after like, oh, how many people did this radicalize? Like this was great. This was really great. And someone will come and be a one stater and talk about the one state, and everyone's like, wow, yeah, this pushed the line. And don't be wrong, I do think that like there is space for that. And I think that like a lot of those lectures and discussions are really useful, but also like, these people are being funded by the university to come. There's inherently a limit on what they can talk about. Right? Just the contradictions kind of flare up. Even, like we started meeting and working with organizers from the city, and you meet them and they're like, actually, this university has only ever existed to harm the people around it. Or like, oh, actually, like, I celebrate Hamas every day. That's not something you can say on campus. And I think it also just broadens people's political horizons and like what is okay to articulate. Because I think that's a big thing in the university that we don't talk about is like the self-censorship. What actually is okay to articulate, and actually like, what should we be articulating? What do we have a responsibility to articulate?
It sounds like there's a directness to that, like a connectedness that maybe it's almost like you can have this awesome lefty professor who assigns you George Jackson and you get to read Soledad Brothers or something like that. It's amazing. But what you're talking about is, what if you had George Jackson just come talk, right? I don't know.
Yeah. I think this is kind of moving back to something that I mentioned earlier, like the idea of kind of during the encampment in 2024, I think there was a lot of focus on just trying to like get numbers and get like more professors teaching classes, like more bodies like at the encampment. Um, and I think there was like a certain value to that in terms of just like protecting like organizers or like trying to. But also I think what that ended up doing is like wasting a lot of like energy and resources playing into kind of um trying to like bring people into the movement. I think that was something that I definitely fell into, especially in the like role of like a Jewish anti-Zionist organizer. Like I think I kind of had this like false perception that I needed to like reach out to all of the Zionist professors who were like having community conversations about Jewish feelings and framing it as like, oh, we're pro-Palestine too, and we like, you know, think we're not like against the encampment, but like we just want to like have space for Jewish students, you know? And I think I think there were other people with me who like spent a lot of time and energy like trying to like get basically just liberal Zionists to like not be so Zionist and like maybe come to the encampment. And I think that kind of energy of like just trying to bring people and like provide them a political education or like have um arguments and conversations with them just because they're Jewish and claim to be pro-Palestine, but actually are just repeating Zionist talking points about feeling unsafe when in fact their material reality is that they're completely fine and like are not being impacted by anything really and are actually just deeply Islamophobic and racist. I think that was like definitely like a waste of time. I think in the name of trying to like bring bodies and like dilute the kind of Zionist responses, I think I just like wasted a lot of time
I
talking to
wouldn't
people.
say. No,
I
sorry,
don't
sorry,
know
sorry.
how
Not to say waste, but I think the two of you have pointed out one of the most amazing things about the encampments was that they were messy experiments,
yeah.
right? And you were figuring shit out. Yeah, of course, it feels very frustrating to deal with Zionists who, I would add to your point, Jay, their statements, as we hear all the time, their statements of "I feel unsafe" are actually making it unsafe for others. Right? Their discomfort presented as feeling unsafe is actually, you're right, both Islamophobic and creates unsafe conditions for other students. But yeah, no, sorry,
Yeah.
I interrupted.
No, I think that's fair. I think, like, there were the logic of, like, trying to create Jewish anti-Zionist community and build that outside of Zionist institutions and, like, have things like we organize, like, a Seder, like, at the encampment and doing things like that, I think, built a sense of community and, like, brought people in. But also, I do think there is value in kind of having political lines and not putting all this emotional labor into bringing people to the table, and in doing that, kind of playing into liberal Zionist narratives, which I think is something that a lot of, like, mainstream Jewish anti-Zionist organizations who are, like, training student organizers do. I think, like, constantly emphasizing. And I think that's kind of what we realized over, like, the following year. I think A, like, alluded to this, but, like, once there was a much greater level of, like, repression from the institution, seeing, like, who actually stood up for students who were being targeted, and none of those students were Jewish in our context, and the majority of them were not white. So I think just being conscious of that and realizing, like, there was an overemphasis on Jewish anti-Zionist students trying to, like, bring more people to the table, when it's like, well, actually, a lot of those people were not ever truly in solidarity, just because they maybe showed up one time at the encampment to have a conversation. And also professors too were not willing to put anything on the line, even if they had a very large degree of security from the institution. They weren't willing to put things on the line to protect the students whose lives were being destroyed by institutional repression and surveillance and all of that. And I think the time between the encampment in 2024 and the encampment, the second encampment, like, a year later, showed just, like, the how, like, repression from the institution kind of plays a role in who is radicalized and then has, like, a sense of solidarity and maintains that even while facing this depression, and who is kind of, okay, I learned some information, but I'm not gonna, like, actually act on it.
I think that really hits on, in a way, the limits of education. That's something I've been struggling with, right? I think we so often fall into this liberal trap of, we can educate our way out of Zionism, we can educate our way. I think, people even would do this with, like, the Trump elections, right? Oh, if we could just educate people, we'd get there. And to see then also the other side of this with, you pointed out, students putting themselves on the line to specifically fight a genocide, and people are, maybe showing up to say, oh, we can have a dialogue, as if that makes any, we can learn and study together, as if that makes any contribution. So before I want to ask one more question, but before we get there, I wonder if we could just dig in, like, a tiny bit to some examples of, like, educational activities happening. I think there's some very famous ones of cultural events you mentioned, a Shabbat dinner. I know there were libraries popping up at these things. Any examples that the two of you took to? Any reading groups you participate in? Memorable teach-ins?
I think one thing that was really great, that was kind of underrated, were the film screenings. Because one of the seniors involved in leadership, she was Palestinian and was really, really into film and knew a lot about Palestinian film and everything. And so kind of set up like a theater type of thing. I was like obviously like a bed sheet type thing, but had a projector. And then also what was really great was there is a very large, tall clock tower, bell tower, right next to where we had our encampment. And we did a screening of Janine projected onto the bell tower, which was really great because not only was it just like a really great experience, but like so many people who are just like even walking to the dining hall will walk by and we're like, oh shit, there's a movie playing on the bell tower, and would like stop for a bit to watch. And like I watched a lot of people who were just like headed about their day walking on campus stop and like watch what's happening on the bell tower. And I was it's like an amazing film. I just like rewatched it last week. And but I think that stuff is really cool. And I think that's like what the main thing of the encampment is. It's putting the education in your face. The film screen is really great, and that was also just like really, really sick. I think that type of and projections are something we've tried to like kind of keep consistent, but then obviously like last time we did a projection, like 10 public safety officers pulled up on us. And yeah, they're like teachings are really cool. Like there was a professor from another university who had spent a lot of time in Gaza and did a really cool teaching about public health in Gaza. So yeah, I think it was just a lot of those types of events. Also, like there was like even like a makluba night where people cooked and everything like that.
Had you all had makluba before?
That was my first time at the encampment. It was a great time.
Yeah, it's great. I think like everything that, yeah, the like main things that I was thinking of, were things that you mentioned. But I think also just I remember a lot of just like teach-ins that kind of took the form of just like sitting in a circle and like chatting. And also they really kind of centered um students like experiences and like what they were studying and their like expertise in like this very specific area, which was really cool. People being able to kind of combine things that they'd learned in a class and just like, share it with a group of other students and combine that with like their own personal identity. I think that was one of the most valuable things of just like being able to see like the stuff that people are passionate about and the things that they like study on campus, but how that like transformed into like actually a community discussion that is always like coming back to Palestine and always coming back to like the current reality of what's happening on the ground in Palestine. I think the fact that all of the teach-ins, no matter what we were focusing on, came back to that was really important and definitely stuck out to me.
So I mentioned before that I hate this idea of outcome-based education. So I'm going to ask this with like full awareness that it's kind of a bullshit question, but the encampments were about 15, 16 months ago. Your university has tried to do things since April and May of 2024 and has been met with severe repression. I'm of the generation of Occupy was a failure because we didn't end capitalism. So therefore, it was pointless. So I don't want to think like, okay, like, therefore we shouldn't do anything. But I am wondering, what now? Like, how do we continue to make these messy experiments? How do we continue to, as you point out, open our political imagination and offer new things? How do we continue to build these radical acts of solidarity in this time that so many people feel so hopeless?
I mean, that is the question. For sure. I think I've been thinking a lot about this, and I think that like there's no way to really know, but we need something new, if that makes sense. And I know people say that, and it's kind of annoying because it's like, okay, that doesn't mean anything. But I don't mean something new isn't like, oh, like we've been doing the same things over and over again. But I think like we need to zoom out, because I think that in many ways, like, I think that I think one thing people always like to evaluate the encampments is like, oh, were they a success, or and I think like, I mean, yeah, one obviously like just that those kind of like objective based analysis are kind of dumb, but people talk about the encampments as like, oh, were they a success or failure, and they're like, oh, what actions were taken, what was the response, like what material outcomes did you get? Like for me, I think it's much more analysis of like who's still in the movement. And I think that's what really gets me, not into success or failure, but kind of just thinking about like, okay, like in the context of a small liberal arts college like us, we were at a point where like 1/5 of our campus at some point was at the encampment, which is crazy. Obviously not all of them are like super meaningfully engaged, but you know, and but also like, how much of it was like politically conscious, that's another thing to engage. But I think so many people have left the movement for a variety of different reasons. Some have been repressed, many have graduated, others have kind of taken upon more careerist approaches. I think what we need to be thinking about is like, I think I actually had a long conversation with someone about this like last night. Is it kind of going back to the basics and not on like the like, oh, we need to talk to liberals, but more the basics of like actually like investigating the conditions of our community. Like, okay, why are people leaving? Right. And like, what does it mean to bring people back in? Not in a way of like a grievance process, but literally in a way of things are getting worse and things have been getting worse. And that's the whole thing that I think I really think about is like so many people when asked why they were organizing in spring 2024, well, they were like, oh, this is the worst thing I've ever seen. And it's like, well, this is now worse, the worst thing I've ever seen. Sorry. Yeah. So just to go back to your question about like, what is it to move forward? I think like also we have to be engaging with the community around us in a much more productive way. And I think that like there are channels for people outside the university who have been thinking about these things, but don't have access to the resources that we have access to, and like actually opening up the campus that way. And I don't know, I think that the last thing I'll say about this is I think that we need to maybe take our time and plan out our approaches on like really doing like the like non-sexy shit of like who do we need to meet with? What types of connections do we need to build? And like what is our long-term plan for building a culture? And I think about that just because one thing I've been thinking about a lot because I've been out of the country for the last 2 months. So it's been like my first organizing break in like basically 2 years, which I really want to take, but happened. And I was zooming back and just kind of thinking a lot of the fact that like in many ways, I think right now is a lot of depression organized. And I think that's something we're also like afraid to name, which is that like so many of us who are still here, so many people have left. We don't necessarily have a set program. A lot of our organizations are not what they used to be, but we're like, I literally cannot live witnessing this without doing anything. So it's like, okay, something happens, I need to do something. Something happens, I need to do something out late, which is obviously good. Like I'm the same way. I'm very much like that. But also sometimes the right approach is like, okay, something happens, like what is in line with the strategy we are pushing forward to do something. And I think like one of the reasons why our movement has been so inherently reactive is like the conditions on the ground are so intense. Constant. We are reacting. And like we are humans that are like, holy shit, I need to do something now. And I think like that really worked at the beginning. But now that more and more people are leaving, more and more people are just kind of sitting in it. And I think it is losing the liberatory framework. And it is becoming a very defeatist of like, well, we did all this, nothing's changing, you know? And like really just grounding ourselves in the histories of the struggle. And I think the Palestinian histories of struggle, because like, and I think that's the other thing is that we need to really be focusing on more Palestinian-led initiatives because also a lot of Palestinians have left, which makes a lot of sense. They're targeted the most severely, they face the most pressure, and also they have the most emotional connection. That's just insanely hard to grapple with. But also because of that emotional connection, the organizing is just at a level of like, actually, I don't get burnout because my family has been doing this our entire lives. Whereas like, a lot of people in the West are like, why, there's just only so much I can take. I don't know. I just think we need to get perspective again and build something new with a long-term strategy. But I am optimistic. I think that people are politicized and people are itching. They're itching. And I think we'll be back.
Yeah, I think also just thinking about, I think when I mentioned people like leaving the movement, I think there are also people who are like leaving the like organizations within the context of like a small liberal arts college is not worth the energy, and it's better to kind of redirect that energy elsewhere outside of that. I've definitely developed this too, of the idea of just like there's so much activism that's been done and nothing is changing. So at what point do you just want to burn everything down and start something new, but also direct more energy like outside of the institution altogether? I think the way to kind of keep people continuing to engage, whether that's student movements within institutions or just generally in movements for Palestinian liberation, is like making sure that there are also infrastructure for kind of mutual aid, both and primarily like mutual aid for Palestine, but also like how are we building trust and like having like networks for one another so that like when somebody kind of is on the brink of like losing everything because of what they've sacrificed for the movement, like how are we actually showing up, like whether that's in the form of just like jail support, like people talk a lot about how important that is so that people continue to show up, like the difference between like leaving, you know, jail and like having people there for you, like providing you with aid and providing you with like community versus leaving and like nobody being there and no one caring. Like that is huge for people in terms of like if they're able to keep showing up. And I think on a larger scale, if we have kind of infrastructure for taking care of one another and for thinking about who is getting burnt out from organizing movements because movements aren't, or like they aren't accessible, like they're burnout and disabled by COVID, disabled by like the realities of our hellscape. Like, how are we kind of emphasizing mutual aid and taking care of one another and building trust for one another? And I think that element of building something new, building a new infrastructure for keeping each other safe and keeping each other like in the movement is something that can build a lot of hope. And that like paired with learning histories of Palestine and of like other liberation movements, grounding the movement in the struggles of political prisoners and like learning about political prisoners in that history is also really important.
Today's episode is produced by Yardain Imran, Samantha Haley, and me. If you like our podcast, please follow us, rate us wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also find us on Instagram at Another Ed is Possible. This is actually our second to last episode of the first season. We're going to be sharing a lot of information about mutual aid campaigns that we're going to pair with the last episode and all of that. We hope that you'll engage and support and give as much as possible, and maybe even a little bit more. Thanks as always for listening. We'll be back soon with a new episode of Another Education is Possible.